June 24, 2009. A military aircraft descends through American airspace. Inside, shackled to his seat, sits a man who controlled 20% of the world's most devastating export. Not oil, not weapons, something far more profitable. For 2 decades, he operated from mountain valleys where no government could touch him. His product traveled to more than 20 countries. His annual revenue exceeded what some nations collect in taxes. And he kept records of everything. Handwritten ledgers documenting transactions that would make Fortune 500 companies jealous. The Americans called him one of the largest traffickers in human history. His own people called him Haji, a title of religious respect. Today, he's landing in Washington, D.C. to face charges that carry a life sentence. But here's what makes this story unforgettable. The case that took 5 years to build, the evidence that seemed bulletproof, the conviction that made headlines worldwide. It would all collapse because of one witness, one lie, one piece of paper that prosecutors forgot to share. How do you catch a man who operates in a war zone? And what happens when your star witness turns out to be a fabricator? Nangarhar Province, eastern Afghanistan. A landscape of jagged mountains and fertile river valleys pressed against the Pakistani border like a wound that never healed. This is poppy country. For generations, farmers here have cultivated the flower that produces the world's most addictive export. The climate is perfect, the soil is ideal, and the chaos of 4 decades of war created something even more valuable: the complete absence of law. Somewhere in this province, sometime in the 1990s, a man named Haji Bagcho figured out how to turn flowers into an empire. The details of his origin remain murky, deliberately so. No photographs from his youth, no interviews with childhood friends, no "local boy makes good" newspaper features. In a region where survival depends on invisibility, Bagcho mastered the art of leaving no trace. What we know comes from American prosecutors who spent years building a case against him. They describe a man who entered the business since at least the 1990s, during Afghanistan's brutal civil war, when the country fractured into competing warlord territories and the Taliban rose from the chaos. Most people saw catastrophe. Bagcho saw opportunity. The collapse of central authority meant no police, no customs inspections, no regulatory oversight. The border with Pakistan became a line on a map that meant nothing in practice. Cargo could move freely, money could flow without documentation, and a man with the right connections could build something that functioned like a corporation while operating like a shadow. By the mid-2000s, that shadow had grown enormous. Here's what separated Haji Bagcho from every other trafficker in Afghanistan. He kept books. Not metaphorically, actual ledgers. Handwritten records of transactions, quantities, dates, and payments. The kind of documentation that legitimate businesses maintain for tax purposes. Except Bagcho wasn't paying taxes. He was building evidence. In 2006, during raids conducted by DEA agents and Afghan partners, investigators discovered these ledgers in multiple locations. One set turned up in a currency exchange shop, a sarafi, operated by one of Bagcho's associates, a man named Farman Shah. The pages told a story that made prosecutors' jaws drop. According to the records, Bagcho's organization moved over 123,000 kilograms of product in a single year. 123,000. To put that in perspective, United Nations analysts estimated this represented approximately 20% of global production for 2006. The ledgers also documented something else: money. Payments totaling over $250 million flowed through Bagcho's network. $250 million, handwritten in notebooks like a shopkeeper tracking inventory. Building an operation this size requires more than ambition. It requires infrastructure. Bagcho constructed something that functioned like a vertically integrated corporation, controlling every stage from raw material to final export. Stage 1. The farms. Poppy cultivation in Nangarhar wasn't Bagcho's invention. Farmers had grown the crop for generations. But Bagcho systematized the relationship. According to court documents, his network maintained arrangements with farming communities across the province. He provided financing before harvest, essentially loans that guaranteed he would receive the raw material when flowers bloomed. Farmers got cash up front. Bagcho got first claim on their output. In regions with no banks and no credit systems, this arrangement made him indispensable. Stage 2. The laboratories. Raw poppy paste is bulky, perishable, and low value. Converting it into refined product requires chemistry, and Bagcho controlled the chemists. His network operated clandestine laboratories along the Afghan-Pakistani border, remote locations where government presence was non-existent and production could continue undisturbed. The labs employed specialists, not university-trained scientists, but experienced processors who had learned their craft through years of practice. Qari, the witness who would later become central to the case, worked in these facilities. He described operations that ran continuously, processing raw material into refined product ready for international transport. Stage 3. The border. The Afghan-Pakistani frontier is one of the world's most porous boundaries. Mountain passes, tribal territories, decades of conflict. All created corridors where cargo moved freely without inspection. Bagcho's transporters knew these routes intimately. They moved product in quantities that required organization: vehicles, drivers, protection, timing. Each shipment represented significant value. Losing cargo to rivals or random violence meant losing money. The ledgers documented payments to people who ensured safe passage, though prosecutors would later argue some of those payments constituted something far more serious than simple logistics. Stage 4. The money. Moving $250 million annually through a war zone with no banking system requires creativity. Bagcho used the Hawala network, an informal money transfer system that operates throughout South Asia and the Middle East. Here's how it works. You give cash to a broker in Nangarhar. That broker contacts a counterpart in Dubai, or Karachi, or wherever the money needs to go. The counterpart pays out the equivalent amount minus a fee. No wire transfers, no bank records, no paper trail that international investigators can follow. The Sarafi shop where investigators found the ledgers was part of this system. Currency exchange on the surface, money movement infrastructure around. Farman Shah wasn't just storing documents, he was operating a node in Bagcho's financial network. The integration. What made Bagcho's operation exceptional wasn't any single element. Farmers, labs, transporters, money brokers, all of these existed independently throughout Afghanistan. What Bagcho built was the connective tissue linking them together. He financed farmers before harvest, guaranteeing supply. He controlled processing facilities, guaranteeing quality. He maintained transport networks, guaranteeing delivery. He operated money channels, guaranteeing payment. Remove any single piece and the operation would stumble. Control all pieces and you control 20% of global supply. This is why he kept ledgers. An operation this complex, with this many moving parts, with this much money flowing in multiple directions, you can't manage it from memory. You need records. You need to know who owes what, who delivered when, who gets paid how much. The documentation that would eventually destroy him was also what made his empire possible. Why would someone running an illegal empire keep such detailed records? Now you understand. This wasn't paranoia or stupidity. This was necessity. The same organizational discipline that built the operation also created the evidence that would bring it down. For prosecutors, the ledgers were a gift. Physical evidence documenting the scope of an operation that might otherwise have seemed like exaggeration. But for Bagcho, they were a catastrophic mistake. The paper trail that would eventually lead American agents directly to his door. The DEA began investigating Haji Bagcho in 2005. This wasn't a typical case. DEA agents couldn't simply surveil a suspect's home or tap his phone lines. Bagcho operated in an active conflict zone, in territory where American military presence was contested and Afghan government authority was nominal at best. Building a case required creativity. The investigation brought together an unusual coalition: DEA's Special Operations Division, the Foreign Deployed Advisory Support Team, the Kabul Country Office, the U.S. Embassy, and the Justice Department's Office of International Affairs. Multiple agencies, multiple countries, multiple years of patient work. Their primary weapon wasn't surveillance technology or intercepted communications. It was people. Cooperating witnesses who could penetrate Bagcho's organization and document its operations from the inside. The most important of these witnesses was a man known in court documents simply as Qari. Qari had worked for Bagcho's organization since 1998. He helped operate the laboratories where raw materials were processed. He assisted with packaging and transportation. He even served as a teacher to Bagcho's children, the kind of trusted insider position that takes years to establish. At some point, Qari began cooperating with American investigators. His testimony would provide crucial details about Bagcho's operations, his associates, and, most importantly, his alleged connections to the Taliban. But Qari would also become the case's greatest vulnerability. Building a case against someone in Afghanistan is one thing. Proving federal crimes under American law is another. DEA needed to establish that Bagcho didn't just traffic generally, he trafficked with knowledge that his product would reach the United States. Without that connection, American courts had no jurisdiction. The case would collapse before it started. So they set a trap. Working through cooperating witnesses, DEA agents arranged controlled purchases directly from Bagcho's organization. Not massive quantities, the documented buys involved kilogram-level transactions. But the quantities didn't matter. What mattered was proving knowledge and intent. September 25, 2006. The first controlled buy. DEA operatives, working through intermediaries, purchased product from Bagcho's network. The transaction was documented, the product tested, the chain of custody preserved. May 21, 2008. A second controlled buy. Same methodology, same meticulous evidence collection. In both cases, according to prosecutors, Bagcho understood that the product was destined for the United States. He knew who he was selling to. He knew where it was going. He proceeded anyway. Combined with the ledgers, the controlled buys gave prosecutors everything they needed. Evidence of scale from the account books, evidence of intent from the sting operations. The case was ready. Now they just needed to arrest him. May 2009. Somewhere in Afghanistan, the exact location remains classified, Haji Bagcho was taken into custody. The details of the arrest have never been fully disclosed. Who conducted the operation? American forces? Afghan police? Some joint task force operating in the shadows of a war zone? The public record is silent. What we know is what happened next. June 24, 2009. Bagcho was transported to the United States. The journey itself was remarkable, extracting a high-value prisoner from an active conflict zone, moving him across continents, delivering him to American soil for federal prosecution. CBS News documented his arrival. Footage of a man in custody, surrounded by agents, facing charges in a country he'd never intended to visit. The images circulated worldwide. One of history's largest traffickers, finally in American hands. The case seemed airtight. The ledgers documenting his empire. The controlled buys proving his intent. The witness testimony connecting him to the Taliban. Prosecutors prepared for trial with confidence bordering on certainty. Bagcho was charged with conspiracy to distribute, distribution with intent to import to the United States, and a charge that elevated the case from major to historic: financing of armed groups. That last charge was the headline. It transformed Bagcho from a criminal into something more threatening, a national security threat whose profits allegedly funded insurgent operations against American forces. The connection between his business and violence against U.S. soldiers made this more than a trafficking case. It was a war story. The trial would prove all of it. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict was inevitable. At least, that's what everyone believed. March 2012. U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Judge Ellen S. Huvel presiding. The prosecution presented its case methodically. The ledgers, translated and analyzed. The controlled buy evidence, documented and verified. The testimony of cooperating witnesses, including Qari, describing years of operations and connections. The defense faced an almost impossible task. How do you dispute handwritten records in the defendant's own organizational network? How do you challenge controlled purchases conducted by federal agents? How do you counter testimony from someone who worked inside the operation for over a decade? Bagcho was convicted on all counts: distribution, conspiracy, and the charge that made headlines: financing armed groups fighting American forces. The sentencing reflected the severity. Judge Huvel imposed a life sentence. She also ordered forfeiture of $254,203,032, the estimated proceeds of Bagcho's operations, plus seizure of his property in Afghanistan, life in prison, $250 million confiscated, the empire dismantled. Justice Department officials celebrated. DEA leadership issued statements praising the conviction. News coverage emphasized the historic nature of the case, one of the largest trafficking prosecutions ever brought, with direct connections to groups fighting American soldiers. The story should have ended there: conviction, sentence, closure. But cases this complex rarely stay closed. Somewhere in government files, there was a document, an assessment dated June 2010. The subject, Qari. The conclusion, unreliable, possibly a fabricator. A different government agency, the specific name remains redacted in court documents, had evaluated Qari and determined that his information couldn't be trusted. They stopped working with him. They documented their concerns. And then, somehow, none of this reached the defense attorneys preparing to challenge Qari's testimony at trial. This is what lawyers call a Brady violation, named after a 1963 Supreme Court case establishing that prosecutors must share evidence that might help the defense. Material that undermines a witness's credibility isn't optional disclosure. It's constitutionally required. The assessment of Qari was exactly that kind of material. Here was the government's own evaluation, saying their star witness might be making things up, and the defense never saw it. When this omission finally came to light, it detonated at the heart of the case. The timing of the Brady revelation matters. Bagcho had already been convicted, already sentenced to life, already sitting in federal prison while his appeals worked through the system. The case was closed, the victory celebrated, the precedent established. Then the hidden document surfaced. Defense attorneys immediately challenged the conviction. Their argument was simple. How could the jury properly evaluate Qari's testimony without knowing that another government agency had labeled him unreliable? How could the verdict stand when the prosecution had withheld evidence that might have changed everything? The court agreed, partially. The financing conviction was vacated, thrown out. The charge that had made this case historic, that had connected Bagcho to violence against American forces, that had transformed a trafficking prosecution into a national security victory, gone. Why? Because that charge rested primarily on Qari's testimony. And Qari's testimony about Taliban connections was, in the court's language, uncorroborated. No other evidence independently verified his claims about where Bagcho's money went. The entire financing charge depended on believing a witness the government itself had secretly labeled a fabricator. The other convictions stood. The ledgers were real. The controlled buys were documented. The trafficking charges didn't depend on Qari's credibility in the same way. But the headline conviction, the one that made this case matter beyond ordinary prosecution, collapsed. Haji Bagcho returned to court for resentencing. The life sentence was no longer on the table. With the financing charge vacated, prosecutors had to work with what remained: the distribution and conspiracy convictions. Serious charges, but not life sentence serious. The new sentence? 300 months. 25 years. For a man convicted of running an operation that moved 20% of global supply, 25 years might seem insufficient. For prosecutors who had celebrated a life sentence and a historic conviction, the reduction was a defeat disguised as a victory. Bagcho's attorneys appealed even the reduced sentence. The case wound through the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, generating legal opinions that dissected the Brady violation, the reliability of cooperating witnesses, and the standards for financing prosecutions. In 2019, the appeals court issued its ruling. The 300-month sentence stood. But the financing conviction remained vacated. The government's biggest claim, that Bagcho funded violence against American forces, was legally ended.